people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, certified Christian counselor and director of Ottawa's Elam Counselling Services.
Hi, this is Michael Hart of Elam Counselling Services, and I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Life Transformation radio show. It is a show where chains are broken and lives are actually transformed. We have had many calls from listeners that have said that they have been touched by the topics that we have been covered. Some people have been motivated to get help that they have needed for years. Others have made breakthrough in their lives by putting in place some of the principles that we talk about on the show. If you're not familiar with Elam Counselling Services, you can find out more about us by visiting our website at elamcounsellingministry.com. Elam is spelled E-L-I-M, counseling with 2 L's, ministry.com. You can also reach us by phone at 613-699-1677. Again, 613-699-1677. So last week we started the show, part 1 of the series, 7 Symptoms of Dysfunctional Relationships. And we looked at the story of Samson and Delilah from Judges chapter 16 as the background to the 7 symptoms. I bet you didn't know that there were 7 things that you could pull from that story. So with me in studio today to continue this discussion is Melissa Waggott. And Melissa, last week you and I got through 3 of these symptoms.
That's right. And so we got through the 3 symptoms being secrecy in relationships, selfishness in relationships, and triangulation in relationships. And the triangulation piece, as we learned last week, because for those tuning in just now may not be familiar, is when one thing comes between a couple. So that third piece that comes into the relationship, whether it's a person or a thing. And as you described off the top, we've based our discussion all around the story of Samson and Delilah. And we described him from Sunday school days as being perceived as this big hero, macho guy with
superhero.
Yes, everything together and what every little boy wants to be.
Yes.
But as we described in last week, and we'll continue this week, is he's actually quite a tragic figure, and the way he's been in dysfunctional relationships a few times in his life, it seems. There's a lot for us to learn and maybe keep an eye out for in the relationships we have today. So we're going to continue our discussion today and get into the rest of the 7 symptoms. And at the end, we also hope to talk and give you listeners a little bit of insight into what you can do if you see these symptoms within your own relationships.
Right. And if you have listened to the show last week, you probably realized that a lot of the things that we talked about was pertaining to Delilah, where she's keeping the secret. She's selfish. But let me just say this, that Samson wasn't totally innocent in this, because I think when there is dysfunction in a relationship, it takes someone else to cooperate with that dysfunction to make it last and to make it happen. So this week we will touch on some of the ways in which Samson allowed that to happen, as well as when we start looking into some of these other symptoms. There is a theory that people who are wounded, that they attract people who are equally wounded to be in relationships with. So if Delilah is this kind of deceptive woman who is so secretive and conniving, then I think it also says something about Samson for making that choice of this relationship. How well did he get to know her before? What qualities did he look for in this woman? Or was he a superficial guy? Maybe it said something about Samson being superficial, where he just saw her and she was beautiful and that's it. Forget about culture, forget about her beliefs in God. She's just a beautiful woman from a foreign country, and so she's good enough to be my wife. And so we see people in today who run into the same kind of difficulties because they go into relationship with their eyes on the superficial. So, she's very beautiful or he's so muscular.
Yeah, and look, my friends will be so jealous.
Absolutely.
We take them out, but for many people out there who have been in relationships and before, you quickly come to realize for a relationship to be healthy, it really needs to go beyond the surface. And as you described there, through the show, we really hope to give tips to both people in the relationship, whether you're the one who is the selfish one or the one who's living with the selfish one, because there's that mutual involvement in the situation as you described. So for the interest of time, I think it's good to get started on the symptoms.
So why don't you start by giving a quick quick version of the story that we covered, so that the listeners who are maybe not familiar with the story of Samson and Delilah.
I hope my Sunday school teachers listening.
I'm putting Melissa on the spot here.
So as you said, Michael, I'll see how this goes. Judges 16 is where we draw this story from. And in this story, we're introduced to how Samson met Delilah. And Samson, as the Bible describes, was a man of great strength and talent, and he was chosen and blessed by God to have those things. But he was also given some rules around what he could and couldn't do to maintain that strength. And so he had held this secret about what made him so powerful and how he could vanquish his enemies. And then one day, a hot lady named Delilah came into his life,
swept him off his
feet and blinded him with her beauty. And they fell in love and started in this relationship. But for poor Samson, he didn't know Delilah had a bribe from people of her tribe and said, if you find out what makes Samson so strong, we'll give you a ton of money because we need to vanquish him. And I
think it was US dollars.
Yes. Whatever is the most on the stock market, she said yes, and she had dollar signs in her eyes. And so she started in this relationship. But unbeknownst to Samson, the reason she was in it really was, as we described, was selfish. She had her own personal gains in this monetary fund, and she also had her secrets going in. She had ulterior motives from the get-go. And so through the story, she tries, and they even describe it in the Bible as nagging. So nagging was even back then. She nagged him for what was your secret. And eventually he gave her the secret to his strength, which was his hair. And in the middle of the night, she lulled him to sleep lovingly on her lap, and they shaved his head, and there went his power. And he actually ended up getting captured. They gouged out his eyes and all these nice things that you forget from Sunday school. And he actually ended up committing suicide and taking out a lot of the Philistines with him in the end. So quite a tragic story. And did I get all the points?
Well, I think you're an excellent storyteller. I've never heard that story told in such a dramatic way before, but I think you did get all the points.
Excellent.
And you know, the points are made in such a way that it just had me listening for more as if I was hearing it for the first time. So we came up with 7 symptoms that we can see in this story that is very common in dysfunctional relationship. And you have mentioned before that we talked about 3 of these symptoms last week: the secrecy, the selfishness, and triangulation. And just for the benefit of those who didn't listen to last week's episode, by triangulation we mean anything or person that comes in between a couple, that forms a triangle, and that rob the relationship of energy and vitality. And so in this case, the triangulation that existed in this story had to do with Delilah's closeness or affiliation with her own people, that she never really bonded with Samson and his culture. Her faithfulness was to the men of her town. So she ended up signing this plot with them to find out Samson's source of his strength in a plot to overpower him.
So the 4th symptom and the new symptom we're going to start in on today is what you've described as undeserved demands being seen in a relationship. What would be an example of an undeserved demand?
So in this story, we see an example of undeserved demand, because we see that Delilah was saying to Samson in the story, trust me, you know, why don't you just tell me this secret that you have? But at the same time, she was being untrustworthy. She was someone who couldn't be trusted, because every time that Samson told her a kind of version of, which wasn't the truth of what is the source of his strength was, then mysteriously the men from her country would turn up at his door to try to overpower him. So she was acting in an untrustworthy way, but at the same time she was demanding to be trusted. We see the same thing in relationships today. And it's so bizarre when I have couples come before me where one partner has been unfaithful, for example, and sometimes multiple times, and they just can't understand why is it that their the other spouse can't trust them. It's been a year now, or it's been 3 months, and so I can't understand why you can't trust me. And so they've acted in a way that shows that they're untrustworthy, they have been unfaithful, but they get upset because their partner don't trust them and can't take their word that they're going to say that they're where they are. But let me say this, when trust is broken, trust has to be rebuilt. And rebuilding trust takes time. Sometimes it takes years for a trust to be rebuilt. So if your trust have been violated, don't be guilted into feeling bad that you can't trust your partner. You shouldn't be able to trust your partner until that partner proves him or herself to be trustworthy. So we see Delilah, after doing many suspicious things, telling Samson that, oh, you don't love me, because if you did love me, you would trust me with your secret. Well, she didn't deserve to be trusted. So she was putting an undeserved demand. So this is where the fourth symptom comes from. This undeserved demands, where people in relationship put undeserved demands on the other spouse, like you should trust me, or you should be loving to me, when they're acting in ways that make it very hard for that spouse to be loving, or you should listen to me, when in fact they're acting in ways that make it very hard to listen to what they're saying, because you're always angry, or you don't talk to me, you don't communicate with me, you should communicate with me, when in fact every time that there is an attempt to communicate something, it ends up in a big fight, because the person can't stand any kind of challenge to his or her position. So they're saying, I deserve to be communicated with, when they're acting in ways that shows that they're not deserving of it.
And so a fifth symptom that's often seen is denial in relationships. And often I think you see this when there's maybe a big issue going on, and we'll talk a little bit about how this relates to Samson and Delilah's story, but you just sort of brush it under the rug, and it's not there. Can you describe a little bit more about denial and why it leads to dysfunction in relationships?
So denial is unfortunately a very common symptom that I see in a lot of relationship, and in a lot of ways it is there because people in relationships are sometimes afraid to admit that this person that is supposed to be their soulmate, this person that they married, that they thought was the man or the woman of God, has turned out to be the woman of the devil or the man of the devil. And so they just can't admit that these very serious things are happening in the relationship. They can't admit that there is infidelity. So they will turn a blind eye to signs that there is something going on, or they will brush it aside, even if they do talk about it, it's very lightly, and nothing is ever done to deal with that thing. So denial is that defense mechanism when someone feels powerless or incapable of dealing with a certain situation, where their mind tricks them into making it disappear, where they act as if it's not really happening. So if we look at the story of Samson, we see a very strong picture of denial in this story, because here we have Delilah asking him repeatedly for the source of his strength. And in verse 9 of chapter 16 of Judges, when he did tell her, right after that, there were men that turned up mysteriously at his doors, trying to overpower him, because now they thought that he would be weak because he had told Delilah the source of his strength. Now she did this again in verse 12. Immediately in verse 12, after he divulged the source of his strength, and she did what it was that would make him weak, there were men turning up at his door again to overpower him. And we see again in verse 14, he told her again the source of his strength, and she did that what would make him weak, and then immediately there were men turning up at his door again. But each time he had lied to her so about the source of his strength. So he wasn't really weak as she thought he would. Now you would think that someone would say, wow, it's kind of mysterious that every time that I tell you, the source of my strength, you do that which would make me weak, and then my enemies just turn up at my door, just happen to be around that time trying to overpower me.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a badly written soap opera. And it's obviously a time before there's the potential for mics in the room or Big Brother listening. So what was Samson thinking? Like, how did he let it get to the point it did? I would think after time 2, at least you'd go, how are they finding this out?
Right.
But what made him unable to just sort of say,
and a lot of time we
it's
look at Samson as this man without a brain. He's all muscle and no brain. But let me say, I've seen very intelligent people, doctors, lawyers, who fall into the same trap with someone they love, because it's as if the image of the person that they're married to doesn't fit with the reality of what they're seeing. So they just find it very hard to believe. So I've seen situations where someone will describe to me actions that their partners are doing, and it's obvious the partner is having an affair, but to this person they think, oh no, they're just friends. Because to admit that there is something going on would be to shatter that image of the person. So it's not that Samson was some kind of a person without a brain. It's that he was in denial because he just couldn't admit to himself that this woman that he loved could betray him, could turn him over to his enemies. That was unfathomable. He couldn't bring himself to think that this woman wants me dead. This woman wants my enemies to overpower me. So it never entered into his mind, even though the circumstances were so obvious. If you have just joined us, you're listening to the Life Transformation Radio Show. I'm your host, Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services. Elim, you can find out more about Elim at elimcounselingministry.com. Elim is spelled E-L-I-M, counseling with 2 L's, ministry.com. You can also call me at 613-699-1677. And in today's show, we're looking at the second part of a 2-part series entitled 7 Symptoms of Dysfunctional Relationship. And with me in studio is Melissa Wagat. And so, Melissa, we have just discussed the 5th symptom, and that 5th symptom that we have talked about is denial.
And so next comes up symptom number 6, which is counterfeit intimacy. And so this is that intimacy that does not reflect a true connection between people. And how is this shown in the story of Samson and Delilah?
So we see in verse 19, we have this image of Samson falling asleep on Delilah's lap. So here is, if you look at the story from the surface and you just took that image of her being this loving wife with her husband in her lap, and they're so close, he's falling asleep, he's feeling secure.
So romantic.
It's very romantic, but it wasn't what it seemed on the surface. So I think in a lot of relationships there is this portrayal of intimacy, but it's counterfeit. And I think there's some couple that I say, my husband only wants to hug me when there's people around or when we are in church, but at home it never happens. So that's what I mean by counterfeit intimacy. It's a kind of intimacy that gives the impression that there is something closer taking part in the relationship, but they're really very, very far apart. So there is something about Samson we see here as well, that Samson seemed to be the kind of person that is very, very prone to having shallow relationships. We are told earlier on in this story that he went to a prostitute in verse 1 of chapter 16. And that kind of relationship, I think, shows counterfeit intimacy, because with a prostitute, he's doing things that would indicate a level of closeness, but it's just for money. And so it's not surprising that because of this confusion between closeness and between sex and intimacy that is now with Delilah, where they're having no doubt sexual intercourse, they're very close physically, but they're miles apart emotionally. On the surface, looking on, you would say, "Wow, I wish my relationship could be like this couple."
Yeah, they look like they have it all together, and as I said earlier, like it sounds so romantic.
Absolutely. So if you were to walk in and see that as a friend visiting, and you say, "Oh wow, isn't this so wonderful? I wish my wife would just allow me to fall asleep in her lap like that."
But as you say, you scratch the surface, and there's so much more there. So the next sign that can be seen in dysfunctional relationships that you've described is manipulation. And I think there's some pretty obvious signs of it within this story. But if you can go into it a little bit further about how Samson and Delilah demonstrate this, and also if you can give us some examples from couples maybe you've met or counseled in the past, that'd be really great.
Absolutely. So in this story, we see manipulation by Delilah in that she manipulated Samson by constant bombardment of asking question to get him to divulge information. But we also see manipulation in the form of accusation. There were certain labels that she was trying to put on Samson to make him feel bad about himself, so that he would give her what she wanted. So she told him that he didn't love her, that he's making a fool of her. And these are all labels that she's trying to put on him, that he's uncaring, he's inconsiderate, he's callous, as a way of trying to get him to fulfill her needs. So this kind of manipulation is also very common in current day relationships, where people will try to make other persons feel guilty as a way of trying to get their own way. So I see very common in relationship in which there is cheating, where one person now because trust is broken, they now can't trust that person, so they get very suspicious when the person comes home late, or when there is a text message coming in the person's cell phone, and if the other person now feels maybe there's something going on, then they will say, "You are controlling." So they give this label to the other person that you are controlling, or you're paranoid because you're always worried about my whereabouts. However, what the truth is that this other person is really trying to manipulate the person into not talking anymore about their actions, so that they can have their own way.
And actually, the feelings of that partner maybe being mistrustful, especially if it's a new occurrence, are well-founded. And it's not that they're paranoid or anything. It's actually based in reality.
Absolutely. If you're in a relationship where someone, as I said in the previous show, where someone has cheated on you, you're not going to trust that person. You're going to be paranoid. You're going to suspect that if the person has used their cell phone, for example, to communicate in your presence with a lover, that someone you found out was later one of their lovers, you are going to be triggered every time that cell phone rings. So these labels that are being given to you, that you're controlling or you're paranoid, these are just an attempt to manipulate and to control. In other words, leave me alone so that I can do whatever I want to do, and so leave me alone so that I can get away with the wrong that I am doing. So this is basically what Delilah was doing. She was putting these labels on Samson so that Samson would be unsuspecting, and then so that he could divulge the source of his strength, so that she could betray him. So you have also asked Melissa, what are some of the manipulation that I see in my own practice? Now, because I see a lot of people who are Christian, a very common kind of manipulation that I see is spiritual manipulation.
So can you describe what that would look like for the listeners?
Well, sometimes it's actually very tragic but very funny. The guy who wants to buy the sport car, the Porsche, for example, and you will say something like, "Oh yes, I had a dream last night. You know, I saw angels, and I saw God saying, John, you can go ahead and buy this sport car." You know,
or the Lord has put a burden on my heart, and we use the Christianese
absolutely
to get what we want from our partner.
Yes. So spiritualizing things, or they want to buy the latest gadget, and somehow you need to have faith, because if you just had faith as a spouse, you wouldn't be questioning my intention to buy the sport car. You would be happy with it. Mm-hmm. And so, we see this as a kind of spiritual manipulation, because what it is, it's a way of putting a label on this person so that this person can now start thinking, "Oh, I lack faith. I should just make my husband spend, or give away all our money to his relatives, and just have faith that God would provide."
Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking about all those conversations. You must hear a lot of very interesting stories. And so with the story of Samson and Delilah, we see it end in tragedy. Mm-hmm. And the consequences of this dysfunctional relationship are basically to probably the most extreme they could be. It ends in Samson's death and the death of many, many people.
The death of the relationship.
And the death of the relationship, and the death of God's promise for his life. He had so much potential and promise in his life, and it all kind of went to this end. So I think, and I'm sure you'd agree from the work you've done, though maybe not to the extreme of death, there are consequences from being in dysfunctional relationships.
Well, let me say this. Just like we see where this relationship leads to the death of Samson, I think in dysfunctional relationship where these symptoms are present, if actions are not taken, it actually leads to the emotional and psychological death of the other person. So people sometimes develop mental illnesses. They become unable to cope. They have nervous breakdown. So to me, that's a death. That's an emotional death. So it's very important that if you're going through any of these symptoms in your relationship, that you seek help. And let me just quickly go through the 7 symptoms that we have talked about in this 2 series so far. We have talked about secrecy, the secrecy that Delilah was keeping against Samson. We talked about her selfishness. We talked about triangulation, in that the men of her country was coming between her and her husband. We talked about undeserved demands. If you're in a relationship where someone is putting undeserved demands on you, then that's a cause for concern. And then the 5th one was denial. We talked also the 6th, which counterfeit intimacy, where closeness, especially for show, but no real closeness emotionally. And then the 7th and final one was manipulation, where we talked about how people sometimes use words to try to manipulate people into the other spouse into having their own way.
So if someone's listened and they heard this echo, where can they reach to for help, or what action should they take?
Well, I think what I see that I'm running out of time here today, so I can't get deeply into actions that they can take. But I think one important action is that if you're in a relationship where you see things happening, where there is secrecy and there is denial, don't go into denial. Don't be silent. Talk about the issues. But I would say get help, because a lot of times you have been so damaged by year after year of this happening that you're incapable on your own to break out of it. I see that we have come to the end of today's show very quickly, so we have to wrap up here for today, Melissa. So if you need help, please give us a call at 613-699-1677 or visit our website of elimcounselingministry.com. Until next time, this is your host, Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services, praying that God would bless you in all your relationships and keep you sound